Welcome everyone to Revolution. We opened with an excellent meeting last night on NATO, Ukraine, and the New World Disorder. And we begin a full day of parallel sessions on everything from the cost of living crisis and climate chaos to rank and file organizing in the trade unions and the fight for abortion rights. But we're opening this Sunday morning with a conversation with, I hope, between two leading figures on the left, Lindsey German and James Schneider, but James is yet to join us. I hope he gets the link, to discuss the prospects for socialism today. My name is Feyzi Ismail, and I'm branch secretary of Goldsmiths UCU, and we are currently in dispute with our senior management over redundancies and fire and rehire practices, which is something we're seeing across the higher education sector and beyond. And what with the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine, and the fact that the government is happy to pour £1.3 billion into weapons for Ukraine, which will only prolong the war and misery for millions, when they could be spending that on subsidizing food and energy and the things that people really need, there's never been a time to be analyzing the current situation and what is to be done, and crucially, what we can do from below and on the streets and in the workplaces. So I'll start with Lindsey. I mean, to introduce Lindsey, and then hopefully James will join us. So I will ask a few questions and to give your sort of impressions of the political situation in Britain today for a few minutes, and then we'll open it out to the floor. So, Lindsey, you are national convener of the Stop the War Coalition, one of the largest mass movements in the country. You've been convener since Stop the War was founded in 2001 after 9/11. You were also a key organizer of the largest demonstration in British history in 2003 over the Iraq War. You're the author of several books, including Sex, Class and Socialism and How a Century of War Changed the Lives of Women, and also co-author of People's History of London. And you recently gave evidence for the Spy Cops inquiry, and you're a regular commentator on politics in Britain. So the first question I wanted to kind of open with is, we've had sort of 12 years of a Tory government, and sadly in this post-Corbyn era, and of course crisis all around us, but movements organizing and strikes on the rise. And socialism has had a bit of a revival recently, certainly with the Corbyn and Sanders phenomenon, but it's galvanized millions. You know, something like 40% of millennials in the US identify as socialist, similar numbers in the UK. How do you sort of analyze that situation? What's going on here?
Thanks, Feyzi. And I mean, obviously, this is meant to be a conversation with James. I was in contact with him shortly before the meeting, so I guess there's something gone wrong technically at his end, but hopefully he'll join us as soon as he can. I mean, I think when we talk about the present situation, just to say a few things, that firstly, the left has gone through, a huge sort of turmoil in recent years. We had the excitement of Corbynism and although I never joined Labour under Corbyn, I was very, very supportive of the whole project and thought that the project was extremely important. We know that was a project which was destroyed by a whole range of different factors, including or you could argue at least partly from within the Labour Party and from within sections of the left in certain senses. Two key questions, the whole question of anti-Semitism and of Brexit, I think were very much used in order to do this. But obviously he was also up against the forces of the establishment, the forces of the state and so on. So I think when we look at Corbynism, when this is discussed in the history books, it will be seen as one of the major defeats for the left, I think, overall. And that isn't at all to criticise Jeremy himself or indeed James, who was a central part of the Corbyn project. But it is, as a matter of fact, in my lifetime, there have been two very, very big attempts at Labour left revival. So one with Tony Benn, of course, in the early 1980s, which the older people in the room will remember, and this also the more recent thing with Corbyn. So I think it's time for us to look at other models of how socialists can be organised, rather than just simply look at them from within Labour. And I know that James's new book is going to do that. Just to say a couple of words about the strikes and so on that are going on now, I think what's important about them, and I think what's revitalised socialists in the last week or so, really, since the big demo last week and then the strikes of the RMT over the last week, has been really that it begins to show the source of working class power. You know, when you look at socialism, you know, the whole history of socialism has been, if you look going back 200 years to the utopian socialists, it's been the whole kind of idea that there needs to be better people implementing policies. You know, that if only we had decent, honest politicians, if only people weren't corrupt, if only they weren't in hock to the employers, if only they didn't defer to the ruling class like so many Labour leaders have done historically, then you could have a very different outcome. But I think, and you know, I think in all ways, having Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, or indeed people are saying this week Mick Lynch as Prime Minister, would obviously be a huge step forward. But you've also got to look at what socialism is about. It's not just simply a moral question. You know, I think socialists do have a lot to say about morality and what our morality really means, but it's also a question of who has the power in society, who has the power. And this was the point that obviously the great advance that Marx and Engels made from the utopian socialists was to actually understand the power of the working class as the exploited class, who had the power to change things. And I think in a very small way, we're seeing a glimpse of this now. And although we're a very long way away from fundamental transformation of society, 1 week of strikes doesn't change that, but it does give us an idea, a glimpse of that, and gives a sense of that every strike or every major strike has the seeds of change within it. And I'm just to say finally on that question, Feyzi, that the whole question of it's a strange thing that people put up with things for many, many years, and then something happens where they begin to see things very differently. We're seeing that now with the cost of living crisis, and with years and years of austerity and declining real wages. And people, Rosa Luxemburg put it very well. She said, when this changes, it's like an electric shock for the working class, and people begin ways they'd lived for decades, perhaps, and they put up with all these things for decades. They suddenly feel they're not going to put up with them any longer. And I think we're seeing the start of that kind of electric shock, if you want to hope. That sounds rather kind of negative, but hopefully, you know, that you're beginning to see people really transforming before our eyes. And to me, socialism has to come from that transformation of working people themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, change can happen very, very quickly. When all of a sudden you think in a particular situation, things are never going to change. Actually, movements can be built and so on. I mean, James's book, and I wonder, you know, this is an issue that you've also thought about. James's book, as I understand it, is about the relationship between the parliamentary and the extra parliamentary sort of left. So it's not about whether you stay or leave the Labour Party, but it's about how to unite all the movements and the voices. How do you think this relationship is working now between the parliamentary and the extra parliamentary left, and how should it work?
Well, I think what James is focusing on is, I haven't read his book, but from what I understand, and so say, hopefully we'll be able to hear from him himself. But as I understand it, he's saying, look, the key question isn't in Labour or outside of Labour. The key question is what we do. And I think that's a very important starting point for all of us, that, you know, there's a lot of argument goes on. We need to build a new party. I tend to agree with some of those arguments, or I think the building a new electoral party has its own problems and has all sorts of difficulties which people should be aware of. But I would agree with that kind of thing. Then there's other people who say, oh, we've got to stay and fight in Labour. Now, the problem is with the staying and fight position. I mean, we've had in recent months, Keir Starmer has threatened to withdraw the whip from 11 MPs who signed a perfectly acceptable statement from the Stop the War coalition over the war in Ukraine. He's now, in a way, even more incredibly, said that any Labour MPs, or sorry, anyone in the shadow cabinet who goes on a rail picket line, or I presume any other picket line, is threatened with discipline. So you've got to say, well, what is it that people are fighting over? And the worst thing is stay and not fight, in my opinion. So rather than getting into probably kind of fruitless arguments with people who do stay in the Labour Party, many of whom are extremely good comrades, but don't see an alternative to that, I think we have to spend a lot of our time discussing what it is that we do. Now, there are obvious things that we can do. We have to oppose our government's warmongering over the war in Ukraine. We have to show solidarity with the strikers at the moment. And that's clearly, there's been an outpouring of solidarity for the rail workers in recent days. We have to look at the whole cost of living crisis, look at Roe versus Wade in America and this threat to abortion that we're seeing. There's so many of these issues. And the crucial question for socialists, if you're not concerned about those issues, if you're not involved in campaigning, whether you can't campaign on everything, but if you're not involved in campaigning around some of those issues, then that is a major problem for you, because these campaigns will go on. And the crucial thing is that socialists need to be involved in those. And so that's the first question. Can we unite, whether we don't agree about, you know, whatever it is? Do we agree about Labour? Do we agree about a whole range of things? We may not do. We may have different analyses of women's oppression. Can we unite around these questions in order to stop the attacks that we're facing, in order to gain some working class confidence and some working class victory? And I think that's an incredibly important question. Then, of course, there are other questions that we have to come to, which is, you know, people say, oh, isn't it terrible all the left are divided? And it is terrible that there's a level of fragmentation on the left in Britain and I think internationally at the moment. But nonetheless, these differences very often arise from quite important questions of principle to do with socialism. So therefore, they have to be debated and people have to decide, you know, what kind of position they take. Do they think that socialism can come through Parliament, or do they think it needs alternative forms of organisation in order to achieve it based on workers' own self-activity? So, you know, those are big questions, but they shouldn't stop us from being able to organise around these specific questions.
Yes, absolutely. The strikes. I mean, the strikes that the RMT are organising now, and you know, the fact that they have got so much support from across society, I think, is very hopeful. And also the upcoming ballots for strike action in a range of different sectors. The trade union demonstration last week was extremely encouraging. But I think you're right. I mean, things are starting to shift, but we have to make sure these struggles develop decisively in favor of the left. I mean, a lot of people would say, you know, this is a lot of people are saying this is a period like the 1970s, but in a way, do you think it's a period a bit more like the 1960s, when you had all of these big political movements that started to intersect with worker struggle? I mean, we have the movement against the war, we have you know, the movements against the climate crisis, we have you know, an uptick in strikes and so on. What would you say about that in terms of the kind of mood of this period?
Well, I think there's a lot of very superficial analysis about the stuff about the 70s. I mean, a lot of it from the Tories, which is that, you know, oh, we've got strikes again, people are listening to Kate Bush, you know, this kind of thing. These are obviously, this means we're back to the 70s. I think it's a mistake to see the 70s as just about industrial struggle. It was a huge period of political change. I mean, women's liberation really, although it started in the US in the 60s, was a movement which only really began in Britain in 1970, or in any sort of substantial way. There were big movements, for example, against things like the redevelopment of Covent Garden, which we managed to stop, or the what was called the motorway box. They were going to build a big motorway box round London. The only bits of it that they actually did, I think, which we still have, are the Westway and the Blackwall Tunnel bit, but they wanted to do that right round and to destroy all the housing. There was gay liberation, really, gay and lesbian liberation really took off again in the 70s and was a big issue. There were things like the Shrewsbury pickets. So I think it's a mistake just to see this as there was lots of strikes then. There were huge numbers of strikes, although interestingly, if you look at the strike days lost, as it's called, or gained, as we might say, they were biggest in 1979, and that was what's called the Winter of Discontent, and supposedly is still the thing that Tories think everybody hates going back to. And then there were, I think, 29,000 days lost, and that was bigger than 1972, bigger than 1984, actually, with the miners' strike. So I think there's, you know, you can't ever look at it exactly. If you look at the 60s and 70s, you're talking about people coming out of a long period of boom. And in the 60s, looking at what's wrong, and particularly in America, but again here, civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the beginnings of women and gay liberation, all those kind of questions, civil rights in Ireland, all of those began there. But you had also an incredibly confident working class, which, remember, the only reason the strikes were as big as they were was that they were attacked as well. They were attacked firstly under the Labour government by a law called In Place of Strife, a proposal which was set out by the Wilson government and which never got anywhere. And then with the Heath government in 1970 with the Industrial Relations Act, which aimed to weaken the power of the trade unions. And you had this huge response to it. Now, it's very, very different now. You've got, I mean, the high point of British trade unionism was 79, when you had 13 million trade unions. We're something like half that now in a bigger workforce, so much, much weaker trade unions. Collective bargaining is much, much weaker than it was then. At the same time, people have also suffered years of austerity. In a way, the movement is more political now, rather than just simply industrial strength, as it was much more in the early 70s. And it also has, you know, there are, Feyzi, as you say, you know, you've got these big issues that concern people, climate being one of the obvious ones, but a whole range of different issues that people are concerned about, the threat, again, of nuclear war. So I would say it's kind of, it's different, but you see, you know, and that's always true with every period in history, but you are seeing now, I think, and I think people feel this over the last week quite sharply, but you can look at it in smaller ways. As we've said, there's been a lot of small, very often successful strikes over the last year or two. You're beginning to see people develop a consciousness which is going beyond, you know, the everyday, and beginning to look at how things can change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what's your, I mean, so we've got all this crisis on the one hand, we've got a response on the other. I mean, things are starting to shift. How do you think, you know, I was encouraged the other day to see, you know, climate campaigners on the picket lines, on the RMT picket lines, and you know, arguing that the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis can't be separated. I mean, people are making these connections. You know, it almost seems obvious in one sense, but you know, as you say, the left still needs to debate, you know, how exactly we unite the movements, what kind of strategies do we adopt? You know, the point you raised about, you know, does change and socialism come from parliament or on the streets from below? So I suppose a more kind of general question around what is the way we can begin this process of, you know, uniting these issues. You know, James starts to talk about this in terms of a strategy for the left in his book, but yeah, obviously it's a kind of, it's both a sort of theoretical question, and we can draw from socialist theory from the past, but it's also a kind of a very much a practical, concrete question, and that requires, experience on the left, as well as bringing together new activists and new people.
Well, I think one of the roles of socialists is to think about how you bring these things together. I mean, by and large, these movements exist whether socialists are involved in them or not. The RMT workers go on strike, the people who campaign sit down or glue themselves to the road in protest at climate questions, all these different sorts of things, they happen anyway. So that's fine. And, people get inspired by them. You go from, people felt massively inspired by Corbynism for several years. Now people feel massively inspired by the industrial struggle. Although that is still pretty limited. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be much more strikes in the autumn, but, the RMT have had 3 days of strikes. They're not, as I understand it, planning immediate strikes next week or the week after. And so we'll see in terms of the level of strikes and so on. But, the danger is that people see Corbynism, okay, it's all about joining Labour and getting people elected. Or they see strikes and it's all about, we want to be like Mick Lynch and we just want to have more strikes. If you look at capitalism, I say, and I stand by the fact that workers have the power to change society, but you've got to deal with this at different levels. There's the economic level, there's the ideological level, and there's the political level. And socialists have to be trying to make those links and say, well, okay, this is about how we take the immediate struggles forward, but it's also about what we do in order to discuss and highlight some of the wider questions. Why does capitalism work in the way it is? What are the forces that will stop possible change, possible revolution, all those different sorts of questions? So I think bringing those together, I think is actually a very important thing for socialists to say. We're the most enthusiastic with any particular struggle, or we should be the most enthusiastic. We should be involved in it as much as we can, but we have to then make the links between the different issues, not just in terms of can one campaign link up with another, can it link up with the third, can it link up with all these different things, but to try and make those links politically and to try to confront the ruling class ideologically as well, because these are all important things. And socialists have a hugely important role to play here. I mean, if you look at Labour and the intellectual life of Labour is, in my opinion, pretty low in terms of education, in terms of ideas, in terms of any of those sorts of things. And usually the only time when it has developed from that is usually when it's been influenced by people from the outside, as it was in the 50s and 60s, for example, by the Communist Party in Britain, and as it has been in more recent years from other socialist organisations. And I think that, those are very, very important points for us to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lindsey. I mean, yeah, it's political education, and that political education also comes through getting involved. I mean, actually doing things.